History doesn't remember the most powerful machine. It remembers what arrived at the right moment. In the early 1950s, Soviet engineers forged the strongest steam locomotive their nation had ever seen. 380 kilonewtons of tractive force, built to drag punishing freight across 1,000 miles of frozen earth. The P-38 could outpull anything on Soviet rails, and the Soviet Union would never use it. What sealed its fate wasn't a flaw in the design. If untold engineering stories buried by history are why you are here, follow the channel. Because to understand what killed the P-38, you have to start with the crisis that demanded it. Steel mills thundered back to life as the fourth five-year plan swept across the Soviet Union. By 1950, the country's output of iron, steel, and coal had surged far beyond pre-war levels. Steel alone up nearly 50%, coal production breaking targets by more than half. Every new ton of metal, every wagon of timber demanded a journey across the rails, but the network that had carried the Red Army to victory was now buckling under the weight of peacetime ambition. The Ministry of Railways faced a mounting arithmetic. Between 1946 and 1952, annual freight on the Moscow to Vladivostok trunk shot from 120 million to 170 million tons, a leap of 40% in just 6 years. Only a little over half the line was double-tracked. The rest was a patchwork of single rails, still scarred from wartime damage, forcing long waits, one train at a time. Axle loads remained capped at 15 tons, too light for the new ore wagons pouring out of the Urals, too frail for the heavier trains the planners now demanded. Depot logs from Siberia told the same story. Sidings built for 30 wagons now had to squeeze in 50. On the steep grades of the Kolyma, locomotives doubled up, crawling over frozen passes at 25 kilometers an hour while lines of freight backed up behind them. At major depots, average dwell time for a train ballooned from 6 hours in 1946 to 14 by 1953. Union bulletins described crews pausing at every stop to shift cargo by hand, turning ordinary stations into makeshift sorting yards. The ministry's engineers could see it in the numbers and hear it in the clatter of overworked wheels. The system was stretched to its breaking point. Something stronger had to come, or the revival of Soviet industry would grind to a halt. In the design offices of Vinnytsia, the question was never just about building something bigger. It was about finding a way to move more weight over longer distances with less harm to the rails themselves. Soviet engineers faced a dilemma. A rigid locomotive, scaled up to the power required, would tear apart the network's tightest curves and overload rails already stretched to their limit. The answer, they believed, lay in articulation, a principle that allowed the machine to bend, not break, under the demands of the landscape. Laboratory tests in the early 1950s offered hard numbers. When the front engine unit could pivot around curves as tight as 140 meters in radius, rail stress dropped by 28% compared to a traditional rigid frame. That single advantage promised to keep tracks intact even as freight loads soared, and it meant the P-38 could run on lines where lesser engines already struggled. The articulated design distributed the locomotive's massive weight, over 200 tons, so that no driving axle bore more than 19 tons, well within the limits set by Soviet mainline track. The blueprint that emerged was a hybrid, drawing on lessons from Mallet and Garrett locomotives abroad, but tailored for the harsh realities of the Soviet interior. The front engine unit, mounted on a pivot, gave the locomotive the flexibility to snake through curves without grinding the rails to splinters. Meanwhile, the boiler rode a rigid central frame, ensuring stability and maximizing tractive effort. This balance of power and agility became the guiding vision for the P-38. By November 1951, the design team, led by V. Yakovlev and L.A. Kozlov, voted to formalize the articulated configuration. Their decision was codified in patent SU-148, filed in 1953, which described a locomotive frame with a swiveling front bogie to reduce lateral wheel forces. The technical drawings that followed captured a machine both massive and surprisingly nimble, engineered to answer the country's call for strength without sacrificing the rails that bound it together. The first P-38 prototype emerged from the Locomotive plant's heavy steam workshop in the spring of 1953, its black flanks gleaming with fresh paint, every rivet a promise of power. In the test yards, crews gathered, engineers in quilted jackets and fitters with notebooks in hand, watching as the locomotive's 12 driving wheels pressed onto the rails for the first time. The numbers from those early field trials set a new benchmark: 380 kilonewtons of tractive effort, a full 40 above the best the FD class could muster. On the test loop, the P-38 hauled a 4,200-ton train up a 2.5% grade, keeping pace at 30 kilometers an hour without a hint of slipping, even as Siberian winds whipped snow across the cuttings. Test logs recorded something almost as important as raw power. The articulated frame pivoted smoothly through tight curves, delivering a 22% reduction in rail wear compared to its rigid-framed predecessors. Axle loads stayed just under 20 tons, sparing the rails and opening the possibility of running the P-38 on secondary lines that would have buckled under the weight of a traditional heavy engine. For the ministry's planners, these figures were more than technical milestones. They were proof that Soviet engineering could answer the nation's logistical demands without tearing up the very rails it relied on. Inside the cab, plant crews wrote notes in the margins of their reports: stable under load, responsive on grade, no sign of frame binding. The prototype's success in the field validated not just the calculations on the drawing board, but the choice to pursue articulation in the first place. The P-38 had not only matched the ambitions of its designers, it had, for a moment, seemed to outrun the constraints of the network itself. In the quiet hours between departures, the real cost of the P-38 began to show itself, not in the roar of the engine, but in the steady grind of maintenance crews working through the night. Articulation had promised to save the rails, but in the workshops, it brought a different kind of strain. Depot records from the winter of 1954 tell the story in numbers. Wheel set inspections rose by 42% compared to the older FD class. Each joint in the articulated frame, designed to flex through Siberia's curves, became a point of vulnerability. Steam seals, exposed to bitter cold, leaked more often than engineers had hoped. Every leak meant another round of tightening, welding, or outright replacement, and the labor hours added up fast. Inside the sheds, fitters logged long shifts tracing the source of faint hisses and tracking down the fine spray of vapor that signaled a failing seal. Reports noted that crews spent nearly twice as long on routine overhauls as they did with simpler, rigid-frame locomotives. The articulated design demanded not just skill, but patience. Every inspection required careful alignment of moving parts, and any misstep risked throwing the entire drive system out of balance. For the men on the ground, the promise of engineering elegance often meant wrestling with heavy steel in freezing air, sleeves soaked and fingers numb. The ministry's quarterly bulletins began to reflect this hidden burden. What looked like progress in the test yards translated into growing backlogs in the shops. As the P-38's power drew attention, its appetite for maintenance quietly gnawed at the schedules and the morale of those tasked with keeping it running. The locomotive's strength, so impressive on paper, came paired with a cost that was measured not just in rubles, but in hours, effort, and exhaustion. In March 1956, a single directive from the Soviet Council of Ministers swept through the Ministry of Railways with the force of a winter gale. The document, stamped Resolution Number 302285, outlined a future that would leave coal smoke behind. The directive declared, "The modernization of railway transport shall proceed through the accelerated adoption of diesel and electric traction. Production of steam locomotives is to cease within 5 years." The language was brisk, almost clinical, but the implications were absolute. Central Committee minutes from that month record the rationale in plain terms. Diesel engines consumed less fuel, required fewer hands in the shed, and promised a railway that could match the pace of an industrial superpower. Coal, once the lifeblood of Soviet transport, was now viewed as a liability, its supply chains vulnerable, and its labor demands unending. Maintenance rosters for steam, already swollen by the complexities of articulated designs, became a mark against the old order. Reports cited a 30% reduction in fuel cost per ton-kilometer for diesel and a dramatic cut in the size of the maintenance workforce required to keep the lines running. For engineers who had spent years perfecting the P-38, the decree arrived not as a technical rebuttal, but as a verdict of timing. The prototype's power and ingenuity were acknowledged in internal memos, yet the momentum of policy had shifted. Electrification and dieselization were no longer distant goals. They were the new mandates, backed by the full weight of state planning and investment. The P-38, for all its promise, was left stranded between eras, a solution to yesterday's problem in a world already racing toward tomorrow. The decision of 1956 did not just end a locomotive, it drew a line under an entire philosophy of motion, closing the chapter on steam with the stroke of a pen. Even the strongest engine can't outrun the turning of history. Today, entire industries pivot on timing more than triumph. The P-38 stands as a monument to innovation, overtaken by change, a reminder that brilliance alone is never enough. For more untold engineering stories, subscribe and join us again.